Welcome to the Deeper Thinking podcast. There are moments now when ordinary life feels strangely pre-translated. A person walks into a restaurant already imagining how the evening will appear afterward in photographs. Someone receives difficult news and almost immediately begins composing the version that will later be sent to friends. A concert unfolds while hundreds of small screens rise into the air, each preserving an experience not yet fully lived. Even private feeling increasingly arrives accompanied by its future explanation. Nothing appears overtly wrong. People communicate constantly. Emotions are named with increasing fluency. Suffering that once remained hidden now has language, community, recognition. A person can describe anxiety, burnout, trauma, boundaries, attachment, grief, exhaustion, and loneliness with the precision previous generations often lacked. This is real progress. It has saved people from silence. Yet, beneath this expressive abundance, there is another sensation, harder to name. Experience often feels active without feeling fully inhabited. A person moves through the day answering messages, checking calendars, completing forms, reacting to news, acknowledging reminders, sending small assurances, deleting notifications, confirming appointments, resetting passwords, opening one more thing before closing another. By evening, much has happened, yet the emotional texture of the day has not quite gathered into memory. The problem is not that people have stopped feeling. They often feel intensely. The problem is that feeling increasingly arrives inside systems, already preparing it for interpretation, communication, storage, comparison, and response. A person wakes and reaches for the phone before memory has fully returned. Overnight messages contain other people's needs, jokes, anxieties, requests, emergencies, small performances of closeness. Headlines appear beside advertisements and intimate disclosures. Before the body has entered the morning, attention has already been distributed elsewhere. Someone pauses halfway through replying to a message and realizes they can no longer remember what they originally felt before beginning to explain it. The speed matters. Emotional life depends on intervals of partial opacity. Feelings need time to remain confused, bodily, contradictory, unfinished. Grief rarely arrives in a usable form. Love often becomes recognizable only later. Shame, tenderness, fear, resentment, longing, and exhaustion gather through repetition, atmosphere, silence, delay. They require duration before they become emotionally real. Contemporary life increasingly compresses that duration. Experiences are interpreted while still happening. Reactions circulate before emotions stabilize. Personal events move almost immediately into message, image, archive, caption, search history, calendar entry, receipt. Even silence starts to feel like an unfinished task. This is not simple technological corruption. People want the interruption too. A notification can rescue someone from loneliness before loneliness has to take shape. A feed can blur anxiety before anxiety becomes specific. A message can postpone the harder encounter with the body, the room, the unfinished feeling beneath the day. Interruption does not only steal attention, it also protects people from forms of contact they may no longer know how to bear. Late at night, after every screen has finally gone dark, the apartment becomes unusually quiet. Pipes shift inside the walls. Traffic moves somewhere beyond the window. For a few seconds, nothing asks to be answered. The silence feels almost physical. Then the hand reaches toward the phone before thought has caught up with the movement. No revelation follows. The phone is checked. The habit continues, and that may be where modern emotional unreality begins, not in the absence of experience, but in the half-second before experience can settle, when consciousness has already started preparing to process it. Once this anticipatory rhythm becomes habitual, interruption stops feeling like interruption. It becomes the ordinary weather of consciousness. A person sits at breakfast with one part of the mind inside the room and another waiting for the phone to brighten. A conversation continues while attention keeps a small opening toward possible arrival. Nothing dramatic happens. Nobody leaves. Yet presence is no longer whole. The difficulty is not distraction in the simple sense. Human attention has always wandered. The deeper change is that wandering has become externally organized. Every pause now belongs to systems waiting to occupy it. The lift, the queue, the bus stop, the moment before sleep, the few seconds after sending a message, the silence after a difficult exchange. Each interval becomes available to stimulation before it can become available to feeling. A person finishes watching a film and reaches for another stimulus before the ending has settled anywhere in the body. These gestures appear minor because they are minor. That is why they matter. Modern emotional life is altered less by grand events than by tiny procedures repeated until they become atmosphere. Unlock, refresh, glance, reply, delete, scroll, check again. The hand learns the rhythm before thought justifies it. The body becomes trained to expect interruption as reassurance. Platforms do not need to force this directly. Their architecture is enough. Infinite scroll removes endings. Notifications make absence feel provisional. Recommendation systems soften uncertainty by offering more of what already holds attention. The unread badge turns communication into pressure. The read receipt turns delay into social meaning. Even stillness becomes faintly accountable. Someone opens a message, lacks the energy to answer, closes it, then spends the next hour feeling the message remain open inside the body. This is also why withdrawal is uneven. Some people can purchase silence through retreats, private rooms, flexible work, long walks, and disciplined disconnection. Others live inside time already claimed by shifts, children, transport, rent, care, forms, supervision, and economic exposure. For them, interruption is not merely cultural. It is infrastructural. The phone may be the source of fragmentation, but it is also where work arrives, school messages arrive, bills arrive, family need arrives, proof of life arrives. So people adapt. They learn to rest without leaving availability. They learn to grieve while remaining reachable. They learn to feel tired and still respond in the correct tone. Over time, experience no longer gathers cleanly. The day contains many actions, but little emotional continuity. Tasks are completed. Messages are answered. Nothing quite becomes memory. A person sits down intending to do nothing for 5 minutes. 10 minutes later, they are scrolling, not with pleasure exactly, and not even with interest, but because unoccupied attention has begun to feel like exposure. No insight is required for the pattern to continue. The person may understand the mechanism perfectly. They may even dislike it. Still, after a short silence, the hand moves again. Reality does not disappear, it remains there, waiting beneath the next small interruption. As interruption becomes ordinary, the self adapts by becoming increasingly observational toward its own experience. A person no longer simply feels sadness. They begin measuring it while it happens. Is it reasonable? Is it excessive? Is it communicable? Is it a pattern? Is it something that should be named, shared, managed, softened, explained? Feeling arrives with a small internal audience already assembled. This reflex is not foolish. Much of modern emotional language has made life more bearable. People can now recognize forms of harm that once remained private, dismissed, or misnamed. They can describe anxiety, coercion, trauma, burnout, avoidance, dissociation, grief, masking, exhaustion. Language can return dignity to suffering. It can make the invisible socially real. But language can also arrive too quickly. Sometimes explanation reaches the feeling before the feeling has reached itself. A person rewrites the same message late at night, trying to sound honest without sounding needy, calm without sounding cold, open without giving too much away. One sentence feels too exposed, another feels rehearsed. A joke is removed because it might look defensive. A softer phrase is added, then deleted. After several revisions, the original feeling that made them want to write has become difficult to locate. What remains is not dishonesty exactly, it is maintenance. The contemporary self survives partly through this maintenance. Profiles must be updated, messages must be balanced, workplaces ask for emotional intelligence, platforms reward disclosure, institutions require personal statements, histories, explanations, preferences, proof. Even private life increasingly asks to be rendered legible in advance. A person says they need boundaries, then checks repeatedly to see whether their absence has been noticed. This is where emotional unreality deepens. The self does not become false. It becomes split between inhabiting experience and preparing experience for interpretation. A person may understand their loneliness perfectly and still be unable to sit with it for more than a few seconds. They may diagnose the pattern accurately and repeat it by morning. They may know why the phone is being checked and still check it again. Self-awareness does not always produce contact. Sometimes it becomes another layer between the body and the feeling. Older versions of the self also remain closer now. Messages can be searched, photographs return without being asked for, platform memories reopen, days the body had already softened. A person looks for one practical detail in an old thread and suddenly re-enters a former self with procedural precision. The system retrieves what memory had been trying to blur. The result is not deeper continuity, necessarily it is archival pressure. The self must live forward while managing recoverable versions of itself behind. Nothing fully disappears, nothing fully settles. Emotional time becomes searchable before it becomes healed. And so consciousness grows crowded with mirrors. The person watches themselves feeling, edits what can be seen, explains what might be misunderstood, preserves what might vanish, and checks again whether any of it has landed correctly. Then, for a few seconds, the screen goes dark. The body is still there, the feeling is still there, but it has waited so long beneath interpretation that it no longer arrives cleanly. The expansion of emotional language changes this again. Contemporary culture now possesses vocabularies for experiences that many people once endured without public names. Trauma, boundaries, attachment, burnout, dissociation, masking, validation, emotional labor, narcissism, self-regulation. These words can clarify what had been hidden. They can protect people from being told that suffering is merely weakness, oversensitivity, laziness, confusion. They can make harm speakable, but a vocabulary can become a refuge too. A person may describe loneliness with remarkable precision while still avoiding the loneliness itself. Another may understand the pattern of avoidance, identify the trigger, name the attachment wound, send the explanatory message, and remain exactly where they were. Interpretation can open experience. It can also arrive as a lid. Someone comes home from an argument and begins categorizing the conversation before the hurt has fully entered the body. They identify tone, pattern, defensiveness, rupture, repair. The analysis is not wrong. It may even be useful. But beneath it, something more basic remains untouched. The ache in the chest, the embarrassment, the wish to be held, the resentment they do not yet want to admit. This is one of the quieter dangers of emotional fluency. It can make unresolved experience appear processed because it has become articulate. The self learns to move from feeling into explanation with such speed that silence begins to feel irresponsible. What do I feel? Why do I feel it? What does it mean? How should it be communicated? Which phrase will make it legible without making it too much? The culture rewards this legibility. Platforms favor clear emotional signals. Institutions prefer categories. Workplaces convert distress into survey fields, well-being modules, resilience language, performance conversations. A person can be asked to describe their burnout in a form that routes the answer back into the system producing it. The emotion is ignored, perhaps even validated. Then the next meeting begins. The contradiction is not that emotional language is false. The contradiction is that it is increasingly asked to do too much. It must heal, explain, justify, protect, communicate, optimize, prove, and manage. Under that pressure, language begins to resemble administration. Inner life becomes something to be filed correctly. Some people have more room to resist this than others. Privacy, therapy, rest, long conversations, and slow recovery are not distributed evenly. For many, emotional life must remain functional because rent, work, children, care, immigration status, illness, or debt do not pause for metabolization. They may know exactly what they feel and still have no time in which to feel it. So the self becomes fluent and unfinished. It explains itself, corrects itself, monitors itself, performs insight, loses the thread, starts again. A notification arrives. The feeling waits beneath the language, still unnamed in the only way that matters. The speed of these transitions matters because emotional life depends partly on duration. Certain experiences only become intelligible through sustained contact over time. Grief repeats itself unevenly. Intimacy develops through ordinary familiarity. Shame often arrives after the event appears finished. Love deepens through repetition more than intensity. Human feeling has rhythms that cannot be fully compressed without changing what feeling becomes. Modern life increasingly compresses those rhythms. Attention shifts before emotional consolidation occurs. Reflection competes with incoming stimulation. Rest becomes porous. A person sits down for 5 minutes and opens the phone, not because anything is needed, not even because anything is interesting, but because stillness has begun to feel like exposure. This is not only a problem of willpower. Many people cannot simply withdraw. A parent waits for a school message. A worker watches for a shift update. A renter checks a payment reminder. Someone caring for an elderly relative keeps the phone nearby through the night. Availability becomes practical before it becomes compulsive. The same device that fragments attention also carries obligation, income, care, warning, reassurance, proof. So silence changes character. It no longer feels like empty space into which thought may drift. It feels like a gap awaiting occupation. The queue, the platform, the lift, the moment after a difficult phone call, the few seconds before sleep. These intervals once allowed memory, anxiety, fantasy, resentment, tenderness, and fatigue to move without immediate direction. Now they are filled almost before they are noticed. A person stands at a pedestrian crossing and checks the phone despite having looked at it less than 30 seconds earlier. The gesture is tiny, but repetition gives it force. The nervous system learns that unoccupied attention should be corrected. Over time, slower forms of experience begin to feel difficult. Reading requires unusual discipline. Long conversation strains against the expectation of interruption. Solitude produces agitation before depth has time to arrive. Even rest is mistaken for low-grade consumption. Someone lies on the sofa after work and scrolls for nearly an hour. No actual pleasure occurs. No restoration occurs. The body remains tired, the mind slightly glazed, the evening somehow used without being lived. This is one of the crueler substitutions of contemporary life. Stimulation begins to impersonate replenishment. Information replaces reflection. Connectivity replaces intimacy. Consumption replaces recovery. The self remains active enough to avoid stillness, but too dispersed to become restored. Memory is altered by this too. Days blur despite constant activity. A person looks back through photographs from only a few months earlier and feels an unexpected distance from them. The images prove that birthdays, dinners, train journeys, ordinary afternoons and conversations occurred. Yet the emotional texture is harder to reach than the record. The documentation feels clearer than the life it preserved. Nothing dramatic has failed. The system has worked. The moments were captured, stored, sorted, retrievable. But experience itself did not remain long enough to thicken. And once duration collapses consistently enough, reality begins to feel thin. Not because the world lacks meaning, but because attention no longer stays still long enough for meaning to gather. The uncomfortable part is that interruption is not only imposed from outside. People also reach for it. They may resent the systems that scatter attention and still depend on them for relief. A person feels loneliness beginning to gather in a room and opens a feed before the loneliness becomes specific. Another senses anxiety sharpening in the body and checks messages, not because a message is expected, but because checking converts fear into procedure. This is why simple stories about distraction are inadequate. The phone is not merely a device of capture, it is also a small instrument of emotional postponement. It offers contact without vulnerability, movement without decision, stimulation without commitment, reassurance without intimacy. It gives the nervous system something to do when experience becomes too open. Someone comes home late and stops outside their own front door. The hallway light hums above them. They can hear movement inside, a television through the wall, a child coughing, the faint domestic disorder waiting on the other side. They are not unhappy exactly. They are not unwilling to enter. But for a few seconds, the threshold feels larger than it should. They check the rota for tomorrow, then a bill reminder, then a message already read twice. Finally, they open a video they do not want to watch. Nothing is solved. The door remains closed. The feeling is delayed. That delay matters. Many people are not trying to escape reality in any dramatic sense. They are trying to soften its arrival, the unfinished conversation, the quiet flat, the relationship that has become careful, the debt notice, the parent needing care, the fatigue that no amount of scrolling repairs. Interruption keeps these things slightly unfocused, close enough to remain known, distant enough not to overwhelm. Modern systems succeed partly because they attach themselves to this need. They do not only exploit attention, they offer emotional anesthetic at the exact point where unstructured experience becomes difficult to bear. A notification breaks loneliness into response. A video breaks fatigue into consumption. A message breaks uncertainty into tone management. The self remains busy enough not to encounter itself too directly. This can happen without illusion. A person may understand perfectly what is occurring. They may even say it aloud. I need to stop doing this. Then the room grows quiet, the body becomes noticeable, and the hand moves again. Not as failure exactly, more like learned survival. So emotional life becomes regulated by small acts that also deplete it. Check, soothe, scatter, repeat. The interruption relieves the feeling while preventing it from unfolding. It protects the person from contact and deepens the need for protection. Over time, this produces a particular kind of unreality. Not numbness, not absence. More like living beside the feeling rather than inside it, close enough to know it is there, but always able to move away before it fully arrives. What makes fantasies of escape complicated is that people rarely want complete escape for very long. The same person who imagines disappearing into silence may begin feeling uneasy after several hours without contact. Someone deletes an app, then returns weeks later, not simply from weakness, but because work, belonging, memory, intimacy, invitations, school messages, family worry, and ordinary recognition have been routed through the same systems that exhaust them. There is no clean outside waiting beyond mediation. The structures are already woven into daily consciousness. This is why the contradiction cannot be solved through purity. A person can resent constant availability and still feel wounded when nobody notices their absence. They can say they need boundaries, then check whether the boundary has produced a response. They can long for slowness while fearing the social disappearance that slowness may bring. The conflict is not hypocrisy. It is the emotional shape of living inside systems that damage presence while also distributing connection. A person sits with friends while each phone rests beside the drinks. Nobody mentions it, nobody needs to. The interruptions are small, almost polite. A glance during silence, a quick reply, a hand turning the screen over then turning it back again. The evening continues. People laugh, stories are told, nothing is ruined. Yet afterward, the night is strangely difficult to remember, except through fragments. A photograph, a payment notification, a message about the next train, the receipt from the bar. Modern emotional unreality often works at this scale. Not catastrophe, leakage. The moment remains pleasant but does not fully gather. Attention is present enough for participation and absent enough to weaken depth. Experience becomes shared and partially evacuated at the same time. For some, the cost is easier to name because alternatives are available. They can take a silent retreat, turn off notifications, go walking, buy privacy, outsource administration, recover themselves through carefully protected time. Others remain inside interruption because their lives do not permit elegant withdrawal. The phone carries shift changes, childcare logistics, debt reminders, medical updates, landlord messages, family need. To disconnect may mean losing control over already fragile conditions. So emotional life becomes collaborative with its own depletion. People help maintain the channels that drain them because those channels also hold their lives together. A mother answers work messages beside a sleeping child. A worker completes a well-being survey after another late shift. Someone grieving keeps refreshing a hospital portal for information that does not arrive faster because it is checked. The systems do not need to conquer consciousness dramatically. They only need to become necessary. And still, moments of density return. Whether moving across a city without being filmed, a hospital corridor where the phone battery dies and waiting becomes physical again. These moments matter because they do not offer escape. They reveal how much experience remains beneath management. Then the charge returns, the message arrives. The person answers. Life continues. The problem is that contemporary culture increasingly treats explanation as emotional completion. Once a feeling has been identified, categorized, shared, and validated, there is often a quiet assumption that something has been processed. But recognition and metabolization are not the same. Naming an emotion may clarify suffering without changing the conditions that keep producing it. Sometimes language opens experience. Sometimes it closes around it too quickly. A person finishes a late shift and completes a workplace well-being survey before leaving. The form asks them to rate stress from 1 to 5. They choose 4, hesitate, then change it to 3, because 4 feels like it might require explanation. A resource page opens automatically. Breathing exercises, resilience tips, a link to confidential support. They close the window, check tomorrow's rota, acknowledge a calendar invite, approve a timesheet correction, answer a school message, delete a delivery notification, and stand for a moment under the fluorescent light, holding the same exhaustion the system has just recorded. Nothing in this sequence is fake. The survey may be well-intentioned. The resources may help someone. The language of support is not meaningless, but the feeling has been routed through a structure that can acknowledge distress without altering the rhythm that generated it. The exhaustion becomes visible, filed, perhaps measured, then returned to the person as something to manage better. This creates a strange atmosphere of helpless lucidity. People know they are tired, know they are distracted. No work has entered private time. No comparison wounds them. No silence has become difficult. Know that constant availability thins attention. Awareness circulates everywhere, yet the day continues with almost no change in shape. The problem is visible and continuing. Institutions increasingly absorb this visibility. A university recommends mindfulness beside debt and overcrowded timetables. A platform promotes mental health while designing for compulsive return. A company speaks about burnout while rewarding the worker who replies fastest. Distress is not denied. It is included, named, supported, and neutralized just enough for continuity to resume. Resistance is absorbed too. Slowness becomes a lifestyle product. Silence becomes a retreat package. Presence becomes an optimization goal. Digital detox becomes content. Even the desire to escape mediation can be scheduled, photographed, reviewed, and sold back as recovery. The hunger underneath these practices is genuine. That is what makes the cycle harder to dismiss. People are not wrong to want contact with something less managed, but contemporary systems are skilled at turning even that longing into participation. This may explain why intensity becomes so tempting. When ordinary life feels emotionally thinned, strong feeling promises contact. Outrage cuts through numbness. Risk cuts through drift. Romance, ideology, fandom, conspiracy, spiritual extremity, bodily challenge, and reinvention all offer the same implicit promise. Here, finally something is happening. But intensity can become another procedure. It must be refreshed, repeated, sharpened. The first shock becomes baseline. The next one must arrive harder. Emotional activation replaces emotional integration, and the person remains both overstimulated and unreached. What remains necessary is less dramatic and less marketable. Intervals in which experience is not immediately converted into proof, improvement, content, response, explanation, recovery, or performance. Time in which grief can stay incoherent, joy can remain undocumented, fatigue can be felt before it is solved. Love can remain partly opaque, fear can sit in the body without becoming a task. These intervals do not redeem everything. They do not remove rent, care, illness, work, debt, loneliness, or obligation. They simply allow experience to arrive before management takes over. And perhaps that is why they now feel so rare. Not because reality has vanished, but because so little time remains in which reality can appear without already being assigned a function. A person sits quietly in the early morning before notifications begin. Nothing important has happened yet. The room is still dim. Distant traffic moves beyond the windows with a low, uneven pressure. Cooling air gathers near the floor. The body feels stiff in places usually ignored. An unfinished feeling from earlier in the week begins returning, not dramatically, not as revelation, but with the slow insistence of something that had been waiting beneath motion. For a few seconds, attention remains where it is. The feeling is not yet named. It is not sadness exactly, not anxiety exactly, not regret exactly. It has no efficient category. It does not ask to be shared, explained, improved, archived, or turned into a lesson. It is simply present enough to become uncomfortable. The person sits with it briefly, unsure whether to follow it or escape it. Somewhere outside, a truck reverses with a long electronic pulse. A pipe knocks inside the wall. The The morning continues without offering interpretation. Then the hand moves toward the phone. The movement begins before decision. It is not chosen in any meaningful sense, but it is not forced either. It belongs to the body now, to habit, to the learned mercy of interruption. The screen wakes, a message appears, then another. Weather, headlines, reminders, a promotional email, an unread notification from yesterday, a photograph resurfaced by a platform that does not know what the image once meant. The room remains the same, but the feeling has already begun to lose its shape. Nothing dramatic has happened. No one has been deceived. No catastrophe has occurred. The person may even notice the pattern. They may think, almost gently, that they should have waited. Then they answer the message. This is how unreality often survives. Not through illusion, but through sequence. Experience begins to arrive. Management arrives faster. Feeling gathers. Procedure interrupts. Recognition flickers. Continuation resumes. Yet the morning has not disappeared. The body is still there. The stiffness remains. The unfinished feeling has not been solved by being displaced. It waits somewhere beneath the next action, changed by postponement, but not erased. Emotional reality does not vanish simply because attention leaves it. It persists as pressure, fatigue, restlessness, longing, irritation, tenderness, strange distance from one's own day. Perhaps what feels unreal now is not life itself, but the order in which life is increasingly encountered. Explanation before feeling, documentation before memory, availability before presence, response before contact, recovery before rest. The world keeps arriving, but often only after consciousness has already begun preparing to process it. The screen brightens fully. For one last second, before the first reply is typed, something in the room remains unprocessed. Then the day begins.